The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Seraphine Wyndham would later think was fitting. Tuesdays had always been the cruelest day of the week. She was 23 years old, Victor's, standing in the narrow hallway of a boarding house in Edinburgh, wearing a dress that had been mended at the elbows twice when the solicitor's envelope finally found her. She had been expecting it for 6 months, beggar. She had been dreading it for longer than that. Inside was one page. The Wyndham Estate, Ashcroft Manor, 300 acres in the North Riding of Yorkshire. The house her mother had been born in, and her grandfather had built with his own ambition, had been transferred, in full legal accordance with a debt instrument signed by her uncle Bertram 8 years prior, to one Stellan Draven, the Duke of Varenmore. The Duke of Varenmore, Booter. The letter, noted with the careful neutrality of men paid to have no feelings, was in residence. Seraphine read the page a second time. Then she folded it precisely along its original crease and placed it back in the envelope and stood very still for a moment in the cold hallway, listening to the landlady's cat move across the floor above her head. Her uncle had sold her mother's house to pay his debts. Her uncle, who had been appointed her guardian after her father died, who had administered her inheritance for 5 years while she was at school, then for 2 more while she tried to understand why the quarterly statements kept shrinking, who had assured her, in the letter he sent just before she stopped receiving letters from him at all, that everything was in hand, everything was in hand. She took the next coach south. It was not a plan precisely what she arrived with, but it was more an understanding of what she had and what she did not have. She did not have money. She did not have a solicitor of her own or a family connection with enough weight to challenge a legal instrument that had been drawn up correctly, signed in the presence of witnesses, and registered with the appropriate court. What she had was the knowledge that Ashcroft Manor required a great deal of staff, that the housekeeper, Mrs. Potts, had retired to her sister's house in Harrogate 2 winters ago, and that the Duke of Varenmore had only taken possession of the property in the last 4 months. He would not yet know every face. She told the agency her name was Sarah Wells. She said she had 3 years' experience as a lady's maid, and before that 2 years in a good house in Aberdeen. The woman at the agency looked at her hands and seemed satisfied. The hands, Seraphine had learned, were what they always looked at. The position was for an upper housemaid, not ideal, but the letter of appointment mentioned that the household was still understaffed and that the housekeeper role was presently being managed by the Duke's secretary until a permanent appointment was found. That was useful. That was, she thought, a door. She came to Ashcroft Manor on a gray October morning, in the back of a carrier's cart, with a single trunk and a reference letter she had written herself on plain paper and signed with a name she invented at the last moment, a Mrs. Cornfield of Aberdeen, who had retired to the continent and could not be reached. The gates were the same. The long gravel drive, the elms on either side, the way the house appeared all at once when you rounded the slight bend. She had not prepared herself for that. For a moment the cart kept moving and she did not. She pressed her thumb into her palm until the feeling passed. Inside, the hall. She was shown to the servants' hall by a young footman named Griffith, who seemed uncertain of his own position and was therefore very formal about everyone else's. The kitchen was warm and smelled of something roasting, and for one disorienting second she was 9 years old and her mother was alive and nothing had happened yet. Then the cook looked up from the pot and asked if she was the new housemaid, and Seraphine said yes, and it began. She learned the rhythms of the house quickly. She had always been observant, and besides, she had grown up. In these rooms, she knew where the drafts came from and which stairs creaked, and that the window in the east sitting room had never latched properly on the right side. She did not use this knowledge in ways that would be noticed. She was careful, in those first weeks, to be exactly what she appeared to be. Diligent, quiet, slightly new to the house's specific habits. She made small mistakes. She asked questions a genuine newcomer would ask. Poor. She let the other maids correct her and thanked them when they did. She did not see the Duke for the first 9 days. He was spoken of constantly in the servants' hall, in the way that people speak of weather, as a force that shaped the day without requiring explanation. His Grace preferred the fire in the study banked higher than the one in the drawing room. His Grace took his meals later than most gentlemen, and did not like to be interrupted during them. His Grace had dismissed the previous head footman for reasons no one would specify directly, but which seemed, from the silences around the subject, to have involved some failure of discretion. He was not married, Billy. This was mentioned by the women especially, with the particular weight that unmarried dukes carry in houses full of women who have learned to read the implications of things. When Seraphine finally saw him, it was by accident. Either. She was carrying a tray of cut flowers from the garden. She had taken it on herself to keep the upper landing arrangements fresh, which no one had asked her to do, but which no one had told her not to do either. And she turned the corner at the top of the main staircase at the same moment he came out of the study. He was taller than she had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected. He had dark hair and the kind of face that wasn't precisely handsome, but was so certain of itself that it read as handsome from a distance. But he was carrying a sheaf of papers and his coat was not fully buttoned, and he looked at her the way people look at furniture, registering the presence without particular interest. "Wells," he said. She startled. Then she understood that Griffith must have introduced the new housemaid by name at some point, and the Duke had simply retained it. It was not a kindness, she thought. It was efficiency. "Your Grace," she said, and stepped to the side to let him pass. He passed. He did not look back. She stood on the landing for a moment holding the flowers, looking at the closed door at the end of the hall, which was her mother's old sitting room, which was now, apparently, being used as something else, because she could hear the scratch of a pen from behind it. She went back down the stairs. She was very steady on them. The document she needed was in the study. She knew this because she had listened very carefully for 3 weeks, and because the Duke's secretary, a Mr. Flint, was the kind of man who felt that efficiency required speaking about important matters in the general proximity of wherever he happened to be, which was often the corridor outside the study, which she cleaned twice a week, the original debt instrument, the full instrument, with the schedules of property attached. Flint had been trying to locate a specific clause in it for the past 10 days in connection with some question from a land agent, and he had said so in considerable detail to the Duke through the open study door, while Seraphine polished the brass on the hall table 4 feet away. She was not yet sure what she would do with the document when she found it. But she knew she needed to see it. She needed to understand exactly what her uncle had signed, and whether he had had the legal right to sign it, because if he had not, if she was still a minor at the time of signing, if the debt had been personal to him rather than properly charged against the estate, then there was a question. There was at least a question. She chose a Wednesday morning, when Mr. Flint went into the village and the Duke had ridden out early. She had 15 minutes, perhaps 20. She took the back stairs. The study was not locked. Why would it be? No one entered it who had not been invited. She moved quickly, without panic, the way her father had always said you should move in situations where panic was an option. The desk was large and old, and she knew it, had sat across from it as a child, while her grandfather lectured her about the responsibilities of property. The drawers were organized with the neatness of a man who mistrusted disorder. She found the instrument in the second drawer on the left, in a folder marked with the property name, and she opened it. and she read. She was still reading when she heard the door. She did not flinch. She turned around. The Duke stood in the doorway. He was not supposed to be back yet. Behind him, through the window, she could see the sky had turned, the kind of rapid weather change that Yorkshire did without apology. And he had clearly come back early because of it. Hootered. He was still wearing his riding coat. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "Wells," he said. "Your Grace." She had the document in her hand. There was no point in trying to put it back. "I apologize. I came to dust." It was an inadequate lie, and they both knew it. He came into the room and closed the door behind him and looked at the document in her hand and then at her face. "That is a legal instrument belonging to this estate," he said. "Would you like to explain why you are reading it?" She thought for a moment about maintaining the lie, about being frightened and apologetic and dismissed, and going back to the servants' hall and thinking of something else. Then she thought about the letter she'd received on a Tuesday in Edinburgh, and about her mother's sitting room being used for something else now, and about 3 years of quarterly statements that kept shrinking. "My name is not Wells," she said. "Alive. My name is Seraphine Wyndham. My grandfather built this house. My uncle sold it to you without having the legal right to do so. I came to find proof. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight." The Duke did not move. He looked at her with the same expression he had worn in the doorway, and she now identified it. Not anger and not surprise exactly, but the look of a man recalculating something. "Wyndham," he said. "Yes, and the reference from Aberdeen, invented." He was quiet for another moment. Then, unexpectedly, he sat down, not at the desk, in the chair beside the window, the reading chair, as if he were settling in for a conversation rather than a confrontation. He gestured toward the other chair. She did not sit. "Your uncle signed that document," he said, ordered, "in his capacity as trustee of the Wyndham estate. He had held that position for 7 years, she said. He was appointed when I was 16 and my father died. The trust was meant to be dissolved when I turned 21. It was not. I did not understand the legal mechanism by which it was extended. I was not advised that it had been." She paused. "I am 23 now. I have been trying to obtain copies of the trust documents for 14 months. My uncle has not responded to letters since February of this year." The Duke looked at the document in her hand. "You believe the debt was not legitimately charged against the estate. I believe my uncle may have misrepresented his authority. Whether he did so in a way that invalidates the transfer, I don't know. I'm not a solicitor. But I needed to see the instrument to know what question to ask." He was quiet for a long moment. She became aware of the fire crackling and the sound of rain beginning against the windows and the fact that she was still holding the document and he had not tried to take it from her. "Sit down, Miss Wyndham," he said. This time, she did. She had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. To be dismissed. To be handed to the local magistrate. Be told, with some legal formality, that her presence was unwelcome and her claim unfounded, and she should apply to the courts if she believed she had a grievance, knowing that the courts would take years she didn't have and money she didn't have. She had not expected him to send for Mr. Flint. Flint arrived with the air of a man interrupted from important work and stood in the doorway of the study looking at Seraphine, who had by now sat down, though on the edge of the chair, as if poised to stand again quickly with an expression of extreme confusion. "The Wyndham Trust instrument," the Duke said. "The original, with the schedules. Not that copy, the one Hartwell sent us from London." Flint went to get it, but "You understand," the Duke said while they waited, "that if your uncle signed in good faith, under authority he believed he held, the instrument may stand regardless. I understand, and that this is my house, legally, until and unless I understand that too." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not frightened?" She was in fact frightened, but not of him. She had decided that in the first 30 seconds, should I be? Most people would be. I've been more frightened of the alternative, she said, which is giving up. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just slightly, at the edges. Flint returned with the folder. The three of them sat around the desk, which was strange, she thought, as a situation. A housemaid who was not a housemaid and a duke and his secretary, bent over legal documents in the late morning rain and went through it. And there, in the fourth schedule, had buried in language that had been clearly written to obscure rather than illuminate, was what she had hoped might be there. The trust dissolution clause, which specified that Bertram Wyndham's authority as trustee was conditional upon the beneficiary's incapacity or unmarried status, and was automatically void upon the beneficiary's 21st birthday unless renewed by court order. No court order had been filed. Her uncle had signed the debt instrument 11 months after her 21st birthday. Mr. Flint said very quietly, "Oh." It took 4 months. There were solicitors in London and depositions and letters that crossed in the post and had to be sent again, and a hearing before a judge who seemed personally offended by the entire business. Her uncle Bertram, when finally located, turned out to be in Montreal, which added a dimension of international correspondence that the solicitors charged considerably for. She remained at Ashcroft Manor throughout, not as a housemaid. That arrangement lasted approximately 3 days past the study conversation, until the Duke told Flint to reassign her to the guest wing and to stop calling her Wells, Lily. She was given a room and meals and treated by the household with the slightly cautious deference given to someone whose status is unclear but potentially significant. The Duke she saw irregularly. He was not an easy man to be near, not unpleasant exactly, but not warm either. In the way of someone who had learned to hold themselves at some remove from ordinary life and had been doing it for long enough that it was simply how he was. He was in London for 3 weeks in December. He returned in December and worked from the study for days at a time and appeared at dinner occasionally and sometimes stopped in the hall when she was coming or going to ask, briefly, if there was news from the solicitors. It was in one of those conversations, in the corridor outside the study, in January, that he said, "Why did you not simply write to me?" She had thought about this, Lily. "Because you would have written back to a solicitor, and the solicitor would have said it was complicated, Lily. And by the time it became uncomplicated, your first year here would have been finished and the house would feel like yours, and it would have been easier to simply..." She stopped. "Simply what?" "Simply wait me out," she said. He was quiet. Outside the window the garden was under snow, the same garden she had run in as a child, the same stone wall along the east side, with the gap where the mortar had fallen out that no one had ever repaired. "I did not know this house had a Wyndham still living," he said. "My uncle led everyone to understand I had died with my father. There was a fever. He allowed the impression to persist." The Duke looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face she had not seen there before. Not the recalculating expression from the study, but something quieter, older. "That," he said, "is a significant thing to do to a person." "Yes," she said, "it is." The hearing was in February. The judge found that the trust instrument had lapsed, and that Bertram Wyndham had signed without valid authority, and that the transfer of Ashcroft Manor to the Duke of Varenmore was therefore void as against the legal beneficiary, Lothian. She was in the solicitor's office in York when the letter arrived. She read it once, then again, then sat for a while looking out the window at the street. Ashcroft Manor was hers. She had thought she would feel more. She had thought there would be something, relief, or triumph, or at minimum the straightening of some tight thing she'd been holding in her chest for 3 years. But what she felt, sitting in that office, was mostly tired and faintly strange and not entirely sure what she was supposed to do next. She took the coach back to the manor. The Duke was in the study when she arrived. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. "It went through," she said. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had expected. "I know. Flint had a telegraph from the London office an hour ago." He paused. "Congratulations." "Thank you." She stood in the doorway. There was a particular awkwardness to this moment that she had not thought through, which was the question of what happened now. The house was hers. He would need to leave. She would need him to leave. Lied. And yet they had been conducting something. Not a friendship. She wouldn't call it a friendship, but some variety of careful, complicated thing across 4 months of corridor conversations and shared solicitors' letters and the peculiar intimacy of 2 people locked into the same legal puzzle. And the end of that thing was not as clean as the end of a court case. "You should know," the Duke said, looking back down at whatever he was reading, in the tone of someone who had decided to say something and was now saying it in the most neutral way possible, "that the east sitting room has had dry rot in the north wall for some time. I've had a man look at it. The estimate is on the desk." She blinked. The east sitting room. The window that doesn't latch properly contributes to the damp. He turned a page. He poured. "You'll want to address it before next winter." She looked at him. "How long have you known about the window?" "Since October. I noticed it the first week." She had been so careful. She had been so certain he hadn't seen. "And you didn't. You were clearly watching for something," he said, still not looking up. "I thought I would let you find it." Behind. The quiet that followed was different from the quiet in the study on the morning she had been caught. That quiet had been full of things about to happen. This one was full of things that had already happened and weren't quite finished. "That was a considerable amount of patience," she said. "I am told I have very little patience," he said. "Apparently, I have some in certain circumstances." She thought about asking what circumstances. She decided against it. Instead, she came into the room. Her room. Her grandfather's room. The room she had sat in as a child being lectured about the responsibility of property. And she picked up the estimate for the east sitting room and she read it. "This seems excessive," she said. "The man is thorough. He's charged for scaffolding on the inside. The ceiling will need to come down." She sat down in the chair across the desk, the chair she had not sat in that first morning, the one for visitors, and she put the estimate on the desk between them. He looked up. For a moment, they looked at each other across her grandfather's desk, in her grandfather's room, in the house that was hers again, and she was aware of something resolving, not ending precisely, but settling into a new shape, the way a room feels different once you've moved the furniture and stopped being surprised by where things are. "I'll need to find a solicitor of my own," she said. "One who isn't currently billing me for international correspondence. I have a recommendation. I imagine you do." Outside the window, the snow that had been on the garden in January was gone. The stone wall along the east side was showing again, the gap in the mortar exactly where she remembered it. There was a particular quality to the light on the snow-gun garden in February, a kind of bare clarity, bland. Nothing hidden, everything slightly more present than it needed to be. "You could stay," she said. She had not entirely decided to say it until she did, through the spring at least, if you had nowhere immediate to be. "The house runs better with someone in the east wing. The staff are more settled." It was not the most gracious invitation ever extended. It was also not entirely about the staff. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had first seen in the doorway of the study, the recalculating one, and then something else moved across his face, something that was not quite a smile but was in the same territory. "I could do that," he said. The fire in the study burned the way it always had in that room, higher than in any other room in the house. She had always wondered why, as a child, and never asked, and now she knew. It was simply how he preferred it. She thought she could learn to like it, too.